Hi guys, welcome back to another episode of Lily's Little Life Corner Pride Edition. Yay! Okay, so in today's episode, it's really hot. I'm melting right now. But in today's episode, I'm actually not going to be reading off of a script. I'm going to be speaking off the dome. I hope it goes right because I feel pretty qualified to talk about this topic. Either way, I'm still going to leave links in the description. I also, if you guys haven't noticed, have a new microphone. Hopefully my audio listeners notice the difference and hopefully it's a good difference, right? But if it's not, I'm going to be upset because I bought this to have better audio quality. I noticed that, okay, this is a mistake on my part. Side note completely here, but I noticed in the past couple of episodes that my episodes have been very echoey. And I know it's because I don't have a lot of furniture in my room, and so my room in general is very echoey, but I hadn't noticed how echoey it made my episodes until like a couple of episodes ago, and I am so sorry. That's my mistake. So but there was nothing I could do with the previous microphone that I had because the microphone had to sit on my little desk that I have my laptop and everything on, and so it was too far from me to capture a sound without echo. So I'm hoping that with this new microphone, with this arm that I have, it's closer to my face, you don't hear as much echo. And then also, hopefully you don't get distracted. I don't know how to turn this setting off where it's switching colors. Hopefully that's not too distracting for my visual people, for the people watching the video. But if it is, I'm so sorry. I'm gonna try and see if I can fix it. But anyway, so today we are going to be talking about queerbaiting because it is something that my friend and I have been noticing more and more often as of recent, and it's pissing us off. It really is. So, and hopefully this comes out just in time for Pride Month because then it's going to be late and then it's going to be a little bit awkward. But that's fine. So, okay, let's start first by defining what queerbaiting is. So it's pretty much what it sounds like. It's bait used for queer people or people of the LGBTQ plus community. Typically where this will occur, and there's some debate on where queer baiting can occur, but we will talk about that in a little bit. Typically though, it occurs in media that you consume. It occurs in TV shows, movies, animated stuff, to real life, like live action stuff. It occurs typically there. Some people, however, argue that queerbaiting can occur with real people. I'm of the belief that you can't really do that if you're a real person. Like, say you're like a celebrity. I'm of the belief that celebrities cannot really queerbait because you don't actually know their sexuality, right? I am of the belief that celebrities can participate in something that looks similar to queerbaiting, where they're kind of like, ooh, am I, aren't I? You'll never know. But I don't think it's called, I disagree with it being called queerbaiting because queerbaiting has a very distinct history in writers not canonizing certain ships, right? That's where queerbaiting first came around. And so I'm of the belief that in celebrities, it should be called something different, maybe like fan service or something. I am aware of celebrities that interact with people of their same gender to kind of get their fans in a little bit of a frenzy. Like, I'm thinking of Blackpink's Jennie and Lisa having very suggestive choreography with each other, despite the fact that neither of them have, one, spoken out for the queer community, and two, come out themselves or even hinted at being attracted to women. However, if we revisit the definition of what queerbaiting is, we know and we see that queerbaiting is intentional and to attract a queer audience without ever committing to canonizing queer ships. So Blackpink doesn't need to queerbait because they already have a queer audience. It would just be like them doing fan service, them telling a queer audience, hey, we see you, we know you exist, have a little treat kind of thing. Same thing with like Sabrina Carpenter and Cat's Eye. They actually have, Cat's Eye has members who have either hinted at or come out and said, yeah, we are attracted to women. And Sabrina Carpenter herself has also said, I'm attracted to women. So again, their purpose is not to attract a queer audience and then not commit to being queer. It's more so just fan service, and also whether it is okay to use asexuality to sexualize on stage. That is a different conversation entirely. So that's where I'm like, I don't think we can call it queer baiting if it's real life celebrities, because we don't know their sexuality. And actually, in the case of Blackpink, it has been suggested that they're not allowed to talk about the queer community. So it is kind of difficult for them to be like, yeah, we support the queer community, when they're under contract and they're being told don't talk about the queer community, right? So yeah, just something to consider, and just my 2 cents on that. Queer baiting, essentially, to me, means that in a piece of media, you're seeing 2 characters, often of the same gender, interact in such a way that makes them look like they're more than just friends. However, as you go deeper into the TV show or the movie or movie series or book, right, whatever it is, you start to notice that the writer has other plans for them. So what this typically looks like is, I'm not too well versed on this TV show, so if I get anything wrong, no, it's because of that, because I've never watched this TV show. But where I first learned about it was the TV show Supernatural with Dean and Castiel. Essentially, these 2 characters are kind of a little bit enemies to friends kind of situation, from my understanding. But fans started noticing that they were acting a little bit like they were into each other. Keyword, each other. So fans started doing what fans do best. They started writing fan fiction, started making edits, started making posts on Tumblr with song lyrics, like romantic song lyrics. And they kept the fandom going so strong. To this day, they are, in my humble opinion, as a fangirl myself, they are one of the biggest fandoms that you can ever run into out there, because no matter what piece of media you interact with, somehow, some way, there will always be a Supernatural fan interacting with that same piece of media that you're interacting with. So if you do follow a lot of like fan accounts on like Tumblr or TikTok or Twitter or whatever it may be, you're gonna come across Supernatural content. And that's how I know a lot of Supernatural stuff without actually having to watch the show, because of this big ass fandom. But essentially, these Destiel shippers are what made the show so big, because it aired on the CW. I did not have access to the CW. I would have never known that Supernatural was a thing, because we were too broke for the CW, right? It's a special channel that you have to buy. If you get like Dish Network, you have to buy the package with the extra channels, with the extra, content, and we didn't have the money for that. So I never knew about the CW, but I still learned about Supernatural because of their fandom, because of how gigantic the Destiel fandom specifically became, and how every single season since I created a Twitter account, which was back when I was 13, ever since then, it felt like every season I saw a new Destiel shipper complaining about how Destiel had not been made canon. And not necessarily complaining, but being like, oh, I'm so sad. Like, everything pointed to the fact that they were going to be canon, and then they never were. Like, what are the writers thinking? When is Destiel going to be canon? And this is where I first became aware of that there was such a thing as queer baiting. And before we get into my rant, I do want to talk about the more serious side of queer baiting, which is the evil side of queer baiting and why it is so evil. It's evil because creators and writers of TV networks, TV shows, big movie studios, they know how much money and how much power the queer community has within marketing. Like I said, every single season that Supernatural was on, since I created my Twitter account, I was hearing about Destiel. I would not have heard about Supernatural had it not been for the Destiel shippers. To this day, all of my information about Supernatural has come from Destiel shippers. Despite me never watching the show, I feel like I'm pretty well versed in the show because of the posts that Destiel shippers have made in regards to the show. This is free marketing that these fans have done for the TV show. And yet, despite the actors and the writers acknowledging that this side of the fandom existed, they never, ever, ever committed to making Dean and Castiel be in a romantic relationship because they didn't want to alienate their homophobic viewers. Do you realize how evil that is? That is why queerbaiting exists, because queer fandoms hold a lot of power and a lot of money in fandom spaces. Wherever you go, there will always be a side of a fandom that ships two men together or two women together, and they make up a large portion of the fandom, especially within fan fiction, fan edits, fan content. They do make up a large portion of the fandom because they're interested in that piece of media because of the potential that it has for queerness, and because we're so deprived and starved of representation. So creators, writers, especially for TV enterprises, big movie studios, they will take advantage of that, and they will feed into that little by little while still maintaining their homophobic viewers interested, while still telling their homophobic viewers, we're never going to canonize this. This is nothing worth canonizing except for marketing. This is why it pisses me off. This is why it's so evil. And even to that extent, this is why I feel like celebrities don't fit under the umbrella of queerbaiting, because their intentions will never be as malicious and as evil as TV networks and movie studios. Celebrities still have the potential, like Jenny and Lisa still have the potential to be like, hey, by the way, we're bisexual, right? Once their contract expires, they still have the potential to go out there and be like, we support the queer community, we're part of the queer community. Dean and Castiel do not have that opportunity to say, oh, hey, by the way, we're going to be in a committed romantic relationship like you guys wanted all along. That will never happen. On purpose, that will never happen. And I actually watched back then a YouTube video talking about queerbaiting as it relates to Supernatural, and I was like, oh wow, I didn't know that there was a term for this. But yeah, that's how I first learned about it, how I first became aware about it. And it really, honestly, if you do want a history on queerbaiting, you should look into the history of Supernatural, because the way that the writers and the actors went about that entire situation boils my blood. I'm not part of the fandom. It boils my blood. It was so, like, the audacity to do something like that is crazy. And I feel upset for the Supernatural fans that they had to go through that, and that they had to experience that, and that they had to be aware that their money and their attention and their viewership was essentially for nothing, right? Because what Supernatural fans would do is that they would tune into the show every week, every season. They would tune in and they would be ready to see if Destiel was canon or not. And the actors and the writers knew this, and the actors and the writers would consistently post on their social media, Destiel shippers, get ready for the new episode, wink wink, nudge nudge. So every single time that the actors and the writers posted on their social media something along those lines, the Supernatural fans would be all up on it, right? All up in it. They would be like, oh my god, it's finally gonna be canon, I'm gonna tune in and we're gonna be celebrating and it's gonna be so much fun. And then it would never happen, and then the episode would end with them saying, I'm really glad you're my friend. The end. Right? The season would end much the same way. Really glad we're friends. The end. The end of Supernatural came, and the finale is something that I remember reading about on my Tumblr timeline and being like, if I were a Supernatural fan, I don't think I would ever interact with Supernatural content ever again in my entire life. And this, to this day, remains why I'm never getting into Supernatural. It sounds really interesting from what I heard. It sounds like a show that is really easy to get into, really easy to fall in love with. But to this day, this remains the reason why I personally will never, ever watch that TV show, because the way that the writers and the actors acted throughout the entire series, only to get to this finale, is something that I will never forget. It's honestly something that I will never forget and I will never get past and can never get past. So the finale comes around and Castiel, being an angel, you know, he goes up to Dean, a demon hunter, and he tells him, you know, I love you. I actually just watched the love confession for myself, and it's so much worse than I thought it was going to be, because I had seen clips of it, but I hadn't seen the full love confession. And essentially they're in the middle of a life or death situation and death ends up happening. You know, spoiler alert, whatever, it's been going on for 15 years. It's not really a spoiler, but they're in the middle of a life or death situation. Castiel says, I love you, I'm gonna go kill myself now. And Dean is essentially like, I don't really know how to take this in, because you told me you are in love with me and then you killed yourself immediately after. And it is such an egregious ending. Like, it's such an egregious ending and such an egregious love confession. So much so that it's become a meme. And the meme is, you know, the first panel of the meme is Castiel confessing, going, I love you, with tears in his eyes. And then the second panel is Dean being like, so the queen died, right? And this meme format has been used ever since. Every single time a new, like, historical event happens, and you'll see it posted all over Tumblr specifically, because that's where I reside. You'll see it posted all over Tumblr, and it's a meme. It's not a real love confession, but this is. And then shortly thereafter, spoilers, Castiel dies. So this confession goes from being something like that. Me personally, if I were a fan and I were watching this TV show and I started seeing Castiel confess his love for Dean, I'd be like, oh my god, it's happening. They're gonna make a canon. And then to add on to that, Castiel dies. That's the writers essentially saying, fuck you. They will never be canon because he's dead. And even if we get a reboot, like most shows are getting right now, he's dead. You know, nothing we can do about it. They're never gonna be canon. When I saw my Tumblr mutuals reacting to that, I was like, y'all are, you guys are better than me. If that were me, the disrespect, honestly, it was disrespectful. So the reason why I talk about Supernatural and I talk about it at length, even though I'm not a Supernatural fan, is because, quite frankly, like I said, if you want a history of queerbaiting, and specifically modern queerbaiting, you're gonna have to look at what happened with Supernatural, because that modern day queerbaiting should not exist. Number one. Number two, it should not exist in that way, especially where the writers have and the actors have strung along a large portion of their fandom for over a decade, only to turn around in the finale and say, actually, fuck you. We don't care about you. Thanks for your money. Goodbye. Honestly, I was shocked and appalled. But that is, okay, I was gonna say that is how modern queerbaiting exists today, but no, that's not exactly. Nowadays, modern queerbaiting, after, you know, the whole Destiel situation, nowadays, modern queerbaiting exists a little bit more subtly and in a way that is able to have plausible deniability. A TV show that I watch called Leverage participates in such plausible deniability queerbaiting, and despite the fact that many of Leverage's fans will come into my comments whenever I talk about queerbaiting within Leverage and tell me that Leverage is not queerbaiting, I regret to inform you, Leverage is in fact queerbaiting. I disagree with the wall. It's queerbaiting. So before we get into that, let's talk a little bit more about queerbaiting, and like, let's, you know, dissect exactly what it means. So like I said before, it's kind of like what it sounds like. It's baiting a queer audience to interact with your piece of media, to interact with the content that you're posting, to interact with anything that you're putting out. And it typically does not start on purpose. With more modern shows, that might be the exception, like with more, you know, 2024, 2025, 2026 TV shows and movies and stuff, that might be more like the exception. But usually, generally speaking, it doesn't really start off with the intention of being queerbaiting. Usually what will happen is that fans will notice that two characters of the same gender are interacting in such a way where they're acting as if they're more than friends. They're acting as if they're closer than friends. You know, with characters staring into each other's eyes and saying, I love you, you know, you're the best thing to ever happen to me. I can't live without you, right? And it's two characters of the same gender. So it seems as though what the writers are doing is planting the seeds, like they would with any heterosexual couple, planting the seeds of a slow burn, which is essentially a fandom term for like a build-up romance, where the romance doesn't happen instantly, but the romance takes a little bit to build up. You know, first they start off as either friends or maybe rivals, and then over time, as the TV show goes on, they start to get closer, they start to realize their feelings for each other, you know, they start to panic about it maybe and talk to their friends about it, like, oh my gosh, I think I have a crush on this person. And then towards the end of the TV show, hopefully, if all goes well, they end up together, or they end up confessing their love to each other, and you know, and then they live happily ever after is always the hope. It's always the goal, especially among fandom. So this is a standard romance building, romance plot amongst TV shows. What is not standard, though, is when the two characters are of the same gender and the writers pretend like they weren't building that up, or say, no, actually that's not. Yeah, like they're staring deeply into each other's eyes, but they're not romantically interested in each other. What are you guys talking about, right? Or where the writers say, okay, I see a large portion of my fandom reacting to this, let's add to this and make them interact with the piece of media more, and then for the finale we'll just like not talk about it, and it'll just be like a vague thing of like, yeah, I'll always be with you, I'll protect you till my dying day, I'm with you till the end of the line. Many such cases, you know. And then it's never addressed again. The finale happens, maybe there's a reboot, and in the reboot it's like as if the finale had never happened. In the case of Steve Rogers and Bucky Barnes, their interactions in Infinity War were completely different and separate to their interactions in Endgame, and it was, many people felt as if it was a character assassination for Steve Rogers because he would never act that way. In the case of Leverage, it's literally never addressed ever again. Okay, I actually wanted to address this point here before anybody comes at me, and for my viewers at home, please ignore the rough draft homework thing that I was doing on my whiteboard, okay? So essentially for Leverage, particularly Leverage Redemption, they did technically address it with some sporadic episodes here and there, and I feel like it got the supernatural treatment where some of the writers on staff wanted OT3 to be canon. For those of you who are not in fandom spaces, these words are not going to make sense to you, so let me define them so that I'm not excluding you guys. Canon means a thing that happened in the show. Well, a thing that happened in the media, right? In the piece of media that you are consuming, whether that be a book, animated show, movie, TV show, like live action TV show, whatever it may be. That is canon. A head canon is something that the fans interpret as being true based on the subtext that was shown in the piece of media. In this case, TV shows often will give their actors liberty to interpret the scenes however they please. So sometimes, even though the writer doesn't intend for there to be romantic feelings towards each other, the actors will portray scenes in such a way that makes it seem like the characters are romantically interested in each other. That is where fans will come in and will take that subtext and will say, okay, well, what if these characters are romantically involved? That is a headcanon. And I think I talk about this a little bit later on, but this is why characters, particularly in live action TV shows, live action movies, don't necessarily follow more rigid kind of things when it comes to like characters, right? Because you would think the writer has all the control for the characters. The writers and the directors have all the control for the characters. But because actors are given the liberty to portray certain characters how they want, those characters tend to have more free will than the authors were wanting to give them, if that makes sense. So they become their own person, and sometimes they can run away from the author, so to speak. Now, Leverage is a TV show. Again, I think I talk about this in a little bit, but Leverage is a TV show that is an ensemble cast. So basically it has 5 different characters. Actually, if you would give me a second, I will show you, for my visual viewers, my physical media collection of Leverage, the original show, because I don't like Redemption. This is Leverage. It has 5 characters, and typically for ensemble cast shows, especially, characters tend to get out of the hands of the writers because there's so many actors to direct, and there's so many moving pieces that often actors will be told you can just improv. So sometimes the improv for the actors turns out to be canon, or at least provides enough subtext for fans to interpret an entirely different meaning than the writers intended. This is what happened with Parker, Hardison, and Elliot, which is, as the fandom knows, OT3, or One True Pairing 3, right? Because it's 3 of them. The actors for Parker, Hardison, and Elliot decided that they wanted to include a more romantic subtext, or at least a deeper connection to the 3 characters than the writers originally intended. The writers originally intended for them to be close, yes, because it is a found family trope, which is essentially where, the characters act like family, but are not actually biologically family, right? But they never intended for the characters to have any kind of romantic subtext. Their relationship was supposed to be sibling-like. They were supposed to have a more sibling interaction, particularly with Parker and Elliot, and Hardison and Elliot. Hardison and Elliot being the male characters, Parker being the only female character in this dynamic. However, the actors decided that their relationship would be far more interesting if they all kind of had romantic chemistry with each other, and the fandom dubbed them OT3 because they wanted the 3 to get together as a throuple, as a 3-person couple. During the run of Leverage as a TV show, the showrunner John Rogers kept a blog where he would write about his experience filming the show, directing the actors, writing scripts, things that go on with the show. And throughout that, he would also answer fan questions. A lot of the fan questions that he would get would be regarding Elliot's romantic love life, because it was clear to the fans that the writers were setting up Parker and Hardison to be romantically interested, but they weren't setting Elliot up with anybody, despite the fact that Parker and Hardison were romantically interested in each other, and Sophie and Nate had a romantic past and were clearly being set up to have a romantic future. And I say romantic past, but it's more like teasing, flirtatious kind of romantic past, not like full-on committed relationship romantic past. You gotta watch the show. I promise, it's good. Okay. So fans would send in questions asking, so when is Elliot going to get his romantic partner? Is he going to be partnered up with any one of the team members on the 5-person team? John Rogers would consistently say, Elliot doesn't shit where he eats. Those are the exact words verbatim. I will include a screenshot here for my visual viewers, but I will also leave his blog in the show notes for my audio listeners so that you guys can check it out for yourselves. I promise you I'm not lying. I read through his entire blog. He said those exact words verbatim. Elliot doesn't shit where he eats. Meaning, Elliot does not get into a romantic relationship with the people that he works with. This is the subtext that the writers were writing into the show. It's also worth noting, though, that even if the actors were adding that extra subtext, that extra queer subtext, as we saw with Supernatural, the writers are ultimately the ones who decide if a relationship becomes canon or not. So even if there is subtext and intentional subtext on the actor's part, it's still not canon unless the writers decide it so. even though I said that thing about like characters having free will, representation doesn't count unless it is explicitly stated. John Rogers was against the idea of Parker, Hardison, and Elliot being a romantic throuple. This reminds me of Supernatural. At the beginning of Supernatural, the showrunner was also vehemently against Dean and Castiel being a canon couple. Then the show got a different showrunner for the last half of the show, and that showrunner seemed to be more open to the idea to the point of conducting market research to see how people would react to Dean and Castiel becoming canon. It never became canon because Dean never said, Castiel, I love you too. It was only Castiel being like, Dean, I love you. In my humble opinion, and the reason why I will never watch the show is because in my humble opinion, Destiel was never canon. This is similar to what happened with Leverage. Now, Leverage originally was only 5 seasons, but then years later, it got a reboot, and we got what is now called Leverage Redemption. They came back as a 4-person ensemble from the original cast and then added 2 original Redemption cast members, that being Brianna and Harry. Now, Brianna is canonically lesbian and asexual, so she is part of the queer community, showing that the writers were not against making the characters queer. However, there is an issue with this within the queer community, and something that has been recognized by the queer community, which is that you never make the main characters gay, you always make the kind of side characters gay. You put the representation on characters that aren't as well loved or well liked by the fans. In the case of Leverage Redemption, Brianna is well liked and well loved, but she is not an original cast member, so she doesn't have the history and the weight to her character being queer, if that makes sense. Like, there is no, the weight behind her being queer is not this, does not hold the same weight as Parker, Hardison, and Elliot being queer, right? I hope that makes sense. Which, you know, it's not to say like this doesn't matter. It's just to say like having a new character come in and be like, well, that's our queer representation, when all along the fans have been asking, can we get queer representation from Parker, Hardison, and Elliot? My point in bringing this up is to essentially ask the question, why couldn't we have both? Why couldn't we have both Brianna, a black queer woman, and Parker, Hardison, and Elliot being a throuple in the same show, right? If the writers clearly did not feel uncomfortable with that, why was only one canon? And even like Harry has moments where it's like, is he bisexual? Is he not bisexual? We don't really know because it's not canon. Like, why couldn't we have all 3? Like, the writers were clearly not uncomfortable with that by the time that Redemption came around. So, and even during Leverage, John Rogers would say on his blog that Sophie had relationships with women. So it's like, okay, well, you could talk about that on your blog, but you couldn't do it on the show, which, you know, restrictions, network restrictions, whatever, politics. But then when you were less restricted, why didn't you immediately move to canonize that representation that the fans have been asking for years? I hope that makes sense. But anyway, that's kind of besides the point. So Leverage Redemption, it showed that the writers did kind of want OT3 to be a thing because there were far more mentions of OT3 within Leverage Redemption. However, they never got canonized. Now again, canon is when something happens explicitly said in the media. Now, I'm going to sound like a bit of a hypocrite here because I have a Tumblr post where I say Parker is not autistic coded, she is autistic. It's not a headcanon that she's autistic, she is canonically autistic. Now, this, by my definition of canon, is not the case because in the show, it was never mentioned that she was autistic in neither Leverage nor Leverage Redemption. However, in the same Tumblr post, I go on to explain that the reason why I feel like she is canonically autistic, even though the writers never wrote it explicitly into the show that she was canonically autistic and never gave her that diagnosis of autism, in the show is because, number one, Dean Devlin, which is another one of the producers of Leverage, said in a behind the scenes interview that she was written as a woman with Asperger's syndrome, which is an outdated term for autism. So he said she is a woman with mild Asperger's. And despite the fact that she was written as a character with autism, it was never explicitly said in the show. However, like I say in the post, it feels out of character for Parker to get an autism diagnosis when she has lived her whole life as if her thinking was normal, as if there was nothing wrong with her, right? Which there is nothing wrong with people having autism, but my point is to say that there would be no reason for Parker in universe to seek out an autism diagnosis if she doesn't feel like she needs to get therapy for issues that she's experiencing, right? To add on to that, the writers did not think of Elliot and Hardison being queer characters, thus they were never, even after fans' reactions, they were never written with the intention of them being queer. This is as opposed to Parker, who was initially, from the beginning, written as a character who has autism. So there is that difference, and you can see it very well in how the characters are portrayed, with Parker being portrayed as a good representation of autism, specifically autism within women, as opposed to Elliot, who is written as a character who was clearly intended to be straight until after the actors made their interpretations on, how that relationship would function. And then it wasn't until after the subtext was included that fans could start noticing and pointing out, okay, wait, this is actually a little bit more than them just being friends. This feels a little bit deeper than them just being friends. That's kind of what I mean also when I say that Parker feels like she is canonically autistic, and not even feels like, in my humble opinion, she is canonically autistic, versus like Elliot and Hardison are not canonically queer, because not only were they not written with that intention in mind, even after fans started, doing headcanons and fan fiction and fan edit and fan content and all that stuff, and writers acknowledging that, but also because there were no moments in the show, in either show really, where fans could point to, okay, this is like without a doubt what this is. Like this is without a doubt queer. Which is why for me, like I personally, as also an autistic character, person myself, I'm fine with that. I'm fine with calling Parker autistic representation because, number one, it was so well done, and number two, it would feel out of character for her to seek out an autism diagnosis, or for even some of the other characters to mention, I think you have autism, I think you have some kind of Asperger's syndrome, you should get yourself checked out. That would be so out of character for all of them and their dynamic, and so that's why it never bothered me that she never got an on-screen diagnosis of autism. However, for queer baiting and queer representation, that is often not applicable because of the environment surrounding it. Whenever I say that OT3 is queer baiting, I always have people being like, well, what if they're X, Y, and Z sexuality? What if they're X, Y, and Z sexuality? And I made a separate Tumblr post saying, okay, and it still hasn't been canonized, right? The important thing to prevent queer baiting is to explicitly say in the text, not the subtext, in the text, this character is queer. And often when I do get that response, the person responding to me being like, what if they're X, Y, and Z sexuality, is typically doing it to kind of point out that it's not necessary to explicitly say one sexuality or the other. However, my counterpoint to that would be, okay, well, you're kind of proving my point, because without explicitly saying X, Y, and Z character is X, Y, and Z sexuality, many people with many different headcanons can say, well, I think they're this sexuality, I think they're this sexuality, I think they're this sexuality. And then if we keep going down that path, no character is ever going to get no sexuality is ever going to get representation, because we're all just going to be in a circle jerk of what if they're this sexuality, what if they're this sexuality, what if they're this other sexuality. And it's like, okay, what's the point in going down that path while at the same time not asking for accurate representation, and while at the same time feeling comfortable going down that path? That honestly, useless circle jerk echo chamber path of like nothing's going to change unless you start asking, hey, can we explicitly say that this character is X, Y, and Z sexuality? Because otherwise no sexuality gets represented and the homophobes win. Like, that's what it is, especially with queerbaiting, the homophobes win. And that matters because that is how you prevent people, homophobic viewers in particular, from saying, this character couldn't possibly be queer. This is what happened to Dean and Castiel. People identified with Dean, homophobic people identified with Jean. Jensen Ackles himself, I'm not going to say he's homophobic, but if the shoe fits, I can't take it off of him, right? But he himself, was like, I don't really see Dean being gay. I think that's something that I would never want the character to be. I would never want the character to be attracted to men. In recent years, he's been quoted as saying kind of being a little bit in between, being like, well, the character is whatever the character is. In the case of Parker and autism, you can't really have people saying there's no way she has autism because it's very clear that she does have, if not autism, then another diagnosis that could possibly fit her to explain why she acts the way that she does. Now, this would be different if with OT3 there were like explicit physical touches where it was kind of undeniable they had a closer than sibling relationship. However, as OT3 was written, there is plausible deniability, which is the whole issue with queerbaiting, is if there is plausible deniability that the character is not queer, then the character is not queer. You have to explicitly say this character is queer in order for it to count as representation, because otherwise it's just a I don't know, queer audience tune in, but homophobic audience don't go anywhere either. To illustrate this further, you will have a hard time finding people within the Leverage fandom that will tell you, no, Parker is not autistic, Parker is completely normal. On the other hand, however, you will not have a hard time finding people, in fact, they're very easy to find, people who say OT3 is not canon, Elliot is straight, Hardison is straight, what are you guys talking about? Parker is straight, what are you guys talking about? It's so much easier for them to say, no, this is not a thing, OT3 just has a sibling relationship, because nothing explicit ever happened with them. So when Leverage Redemption comes around and has these little quips and these little witty remarks of, Parker saying, guys, are we a poly? And then it cuts off, it's not resolving anything. And in fact, like I say later in the episode, it can very easily be explained away by Parker's just weird. She doesn't really understand how normal relationships work, which is not explicit. If you can explain it away as the character's quirks, or as that's just who the character is, there's nothing queer about this, it is not queer. Hence, it is either queer baiting if the writers and the actors and the media itself keep feeding into it, or it is not queer baiting and not queer because the writers, actors, and characters in the media themselves have explicitly said, I'm not queer. However, like I've stated before in this episode, the whole point of queer baiting is to keep both your queer audience and your homophobic audience happy. Are we clear on that? Okay. So if you're a Leverage fan and you're an OT3 fan and you think that OT3 is not queer baiting, please don't come into my comments telling me that OT3 is not queer baiting, because OT3 is queer baiting. Not only has John Rogers said Elliot is never going to get into a relationship with somebody that he works with, but also they never made OT3 explicitly canon in the show. Now, whether they were heading for that in later seasons, should they have been greenlit for later seasons or not, is irrelevant, because as the show stands right now, OT3 is not canon. Capiche? Sorry, that was so rude. But I hope you guys understand where I'm coming from and where my frustration is coming from whenever I talk about this and people just dismiss me as being like, well, they could be queer platonic. Okay, yeah, they could be, but that hasn't been mentioned. They could be anything. They could be trans. That has not been mentioned in the show. If it has not been mentioned in the show, it is not canon, and hence it stands in a gray area where it's kind of pointing towards queerbait. And also the few and far between mentions of OT3 within Leverage Redemption are treated more so as a joke and as if they're kind of making fun of the audience or taunting the audience in some way. Like, I'm thinking when Parker asked, guys, are we a polycule? But it was deliberately cut off before she could finish the word polycule. That to me did not come off as the writers hinting at the fact that they were going to expand on OT3 as a relationship. It came off as the writers making fun of us and saying, this is never going to happen, haha, we cut it off right before it could happen. It just doesn't come across like they actually care about making OT3 canon or adding in that representation, despite them showing that they don't have any qualms about adding queer representation into their show. It feels like we're giving up one thing for another, right? Like it feels like the writers are saying you can either have Brianna, a black queer woman, or you can have OT3, where, you know, this is like a wish fulfillment fan service for all the fans. Like, it feels like they're telling us it's either one or the other. You cannot have both, which is not how representation should work at all. And also, to wrap my rant up, we really should be demanding better from showrunners and from writers, because we cannot live forever in the gray area. We cannot, as a community, live forever in the gray area where we have to consistently be like, no, but like the curtains are blue, so that means, right? We can't continue to do that when asking for representation. Representation is not something that you can just be like, well, in my opinion, because the curtains are blue, this means X, Y, and Z. As a community, we have to demand for accurate and fair representation, which includes not including tropes such as bury your gays, not using queerbaiting, and being far more explicit about what a character is and what a character is not. Otherwise, we're going to be watching the same show with homophobic people, and we're going to be arguing about the same show with homophobic people. Is that really the life that we want? I don't think so. That's not the life that I want. I don't want to be arguing in the comments with a homophobic person being like, oh, Stucky isn't real. And I don't want to have to sit there and be like, no, but like the song, you know, the song went on and, you know, Steve was on the rooftop and so was Bucky as a Winter Soldier. I don't want to do that as part of the community. Like, I feel like we should not have to do that. We should not have to do the whole red tape, dots connecting dots thing to explain to others why our favorite characters are queer. They should just be explicitly queer without shame and without fear, right? That rhymed. I'm a poet and I didn't even know it. But anyway, I hope you guys understand like why this pisses me off so much and why I'm like, no, OT3 is not canon, in fact, because it isn't, right? We can, you know, speculate, we can be like, oh, but like this and this and this and this. Yeah, sure, but it hasn't been explicitly said in the text. And as part of the queer community, we should not accept that as accurate and fair representation or representation at all, because it is not representation. Because when you have a showrunner being like, well, Elliot actually doesn't date anyone that he works with, and even further than that, Elliot was only ever shown dating women outside of the team, like, sure, we can headcanon, oh, it's because he's repressed, it's because he doesn't want to explore his feelings, it's because of X, Y, and Z, but if it's not explicitly said, it doesn't count, okay? Anyway, let me get back into the episode. With Leverage, it was accidental. It wasn't intended to be a thing, but it was a thing. John Rogers, like, I'm not sure if he understands. He must, because they were so popular, but sometimes I wonder if he knew that we were saying OT3 as in like we want them to be together romantically and we want them to be a polyamorous throuple, or if he just thought that we thought that they were really good friends. But he must know that it was romantic shipping, right? He must, because he on his blog said Elliot would never romantically date anyone on the team. It wasn't explicitly said, but when Sophie tells Elliot, you know, protect them, he says, till my dying day, which is kind of like a love confession, kind of like a, you know, I'm gonna be with them for the rest of my life until I'm able to, and I'm gonna protect them. Boom, finale, right? Everybody's abuzz because it's kind of like a love confession. It's kind of like, ooh, there's something deeper going on here. Well, the reboot happens, and we kind of get no mention of it. And so me, as a viewer, excited for the reboot, I'm kind of watching, kind of thinking, okay, maybe we're not mentioning it because it's so normal that it doesn't need a mention in their lives, but certainly we're gonna get a mention of it someday, and we're gonna get told, oh yeah, we've actually been dating for ages, right? And it'll just be something casual, something never spoken about again, whatever. Maybe we'll see them kiss. Who knows? No, Elliot gets a girlfriend. And the rest of the reboot, after he breaks up with his girlfriend, the rest of his reboot is spent dropping hints. And then, yeah, like I said, it's never mentioned again. And so a lot of Leverage fans will tell you is, well, this is not queer baiting because they are, subtly hinting at it. And it doesn't need to be mentioned. It just is. Their relationship is really weird, but that is it. It is what it is, type of thing. It's also worth mentioning that although it would be really, really nice to not have to explicitly say, this character is this sexuality, this character is this other sexuality, we unfortunately as a society are not at that point yet. We as a society still have homophobic people. We as a society still have people who default to heterosexuality, showrunners and writers and creatives included. Yes, we are working towards more inclusivity, but I feel as part of the community, as a person who's part of the community, that until heterosexuality is no longer the default, we do have to explicitly say this character is this sexuality, this character is this other sexuality. Sure, leaving space for analyzing media and, doing the whole video essay thing, whatever. But at the same time, keeping in mind that representation is still necessary. If representation wasn't necessary, we could afford to get into these circle jerk discussions like I was mentioning before of, well, no, I think it's this. No, I think it's this. No, I think it's this. But representation wise, we cannot afford to be analyzing media that way, at least not in an end all be all fashion. Like, it's fun to say at the beginning of a series when it's just barely starting, I think this character is going to be this sexuality. What do you think this character is going to be this sexuality? But if the point of the show is to have representation, the show must conclude with representation being explicitly mentioned and the community that they're trying to represent being explicitly mentioned, not just in side characters like I said before, but in main characters, and not being afraid to show that within main characters. And I hope that point is the one that is coming across the most, and the one that you guys are listening to the most, and that you're not getting lost in the sauce of all the other details that I'm mentioning. I'm mentioning all the other details for fun and for enjoyment and all this other kind of stuff, but I hope that that is the main message that you take away from this episode and from this video, is that representation is still needed, and thus explicitness is still needed. We can't get away with obscurities and what ifs when the default is still straight white man, cis straight white man. That's not how it works, and that's not how it should work, and we're still not at the point where we can be like, fuck it, nothing is explicit here. That's what I want you guys to take away from this. And this is, I think, what a lot of people, myself included, struggle with when queer or potentially queer relationships pop up on our screens, especially now. Like, I'm thinking Young Sherlock. Young Sherlock is a brand new TV show. It's a Sherlock adaptation, a Sherlock Holmes adaptation based on, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's Sherlock Holmes stories. Okay, it's a new show, so I don't want to spoil it, but there are some queer undertones, and I, as a queer person myself, am going through, only season 1 has been released, but every single time we get news about season 2 being developed, I always start to, be a little bit scared, like, what if they're going to queer bait us? Because there's so many queer undertones within Sherlock Holmes himself and the characters that he interacts with, that I'm kind of hopeful that they're going to continue that and that they're going to be explicit about Sherlock Holmes's in-universe sexuality. Maybe in the Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's universe he wasn't explicitly queer, but maybe in the young Sherlock universe he is going to be explicitly queer, right? So I remain hopeful. However, I think I've seen this film before and I didn't like the ending, much like, you know, Endgame and Steve and Bucky, Captain America and the Winter Soldier, you know, much like in Leverage, much like in a lot of other pieces of media, much like in Supernatural, though I never watched that show and never will. And so this is why I say that queer baiting is evil. And I think writers have a responsibility. Okay, I've talked about so many pieces of media and they all have some type of queer baiting. So, but okay, this is kind of going a little bit not in the queer baiting direction, but like more like a question to the heterosexuals. Okay, I feel like you can tell that I'm very distracted here, and sure enough, I do go on tangents, but essentially, my question stems from how Stucky, or Steve Rogers and Bucky Barnes from the Marvel Cinematic Universe, the Captain America trilogy, were treated versus what the creators said about them. So if you guys don't know, the creators, specifically the Russo brothers, who directed and produced Captain America the Winter Soldier, which is Captain America movie number 2, and Captain America Civil War, or Captain America number 3, and then went on to direct and produce Infinity War and Endgame, they kept saying that they only saw Steve and Bucky as brothers. However, if we look at the movies themselves, there's a lot of queer subtext, specifically within how the movies were edited. There's a point in Captain America the Winter Soldier where Steve enters his apartment through a window because his neighbor tells him that there is music playing in the background and that he left his radio on. So Steve is like, I sure did not leave my radio on. I know that means that there's somebody in my apartment because I did not leave my radio on. Let me enter through the back door, essentially, which is a window because they're in an apartment. So he enters through the window. The song is playing. The song that is playing is Kitty Callan and the Harry James Orchestra, It's Been a Long, Long Time, which essentially talks about a woman saying to her lover, it's been a long time, kiss me once, then kiss me twice, then kiss me once again. So that is the song that is playing in the background when Steve enters his apartment. Now, some astute viewers have found that if you continue playing the song as the scene progresses, it essentially sends the message that it is two lovers reuniting, the two lovers being Steve and Bucky. I will actually edit the scene itself and play it here, but obviously I know I have audio listeners, so for you guys, let me explain the scene and how it goes down a little bit before I insert the sped up and edited version of the scene along with the song. So essentially, Steve enters his apartment, the song is still playing, he encounters Nick Fury. Nick Fury tells him that there is spies in S.H.I.E.L.D. and that it is a time-sensitive nature that he needs to get to the people that he can trust, and those are his friends. You know, Steve asks him, is that what we are we friends? Nick Fury is like, yeah, that's what we are. Then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, as soon as Nick Fury steps away from the shadows and into the light, he gets shot. Now his Steve's neighbor breaks down the door, is like, do you have eyes on the shooter? Whatever. Essentially the question is, do you have eyes on the shooter? Steve says, tell them I'm in pursuit. That is when the song cuts off. So this whole time the song is playing. I don't think the song ever stopped playing until until Nick Fury is shot and Steve goes after the Winter Soldier, who is the shooter of Nick Fury. He chases after him. They end up on a rooftop and they make eye contact. Steve at this point does not know that the Winter Soldier is his brainwashed Bucky Barnes' best friend. He thinks this is an enemy that he has to deal with, so he's ready to fight to the death. However, the Winter Soldier cleverly escapes. It's kind of one of his signature moves. But like I said, if you continue playing the song, the crescendo of the song plays during that rooftop scene where Steve and Bucky make eye contact. Now, because the song is saying it's been a long, long time, kiss me once and kiss me twice and kiss me once again, the subtext of this scene is these are two lovers reuniting after being separated for a long time. Given those editing choices and given that subtext, my question becomes, why is it that heterosexual men will say, no, this is just a brotherly bond, when it is clearly and almost like canon, that's how explicit it is, that it is a romantic thing? Because you wouldn't tell your strictly platonic best friend, it's been a long, long time, kiss me once and kiss me twice and kiss me once again. You would only say that to a lover who you haven't seen in a long, long time, right? So that is what my question is, because the Russo brothers are so insistent that no, Steve and Bucky are just brothers. They just have a brotherly bond, nothing more, nothing less. The movies seem to contradict that. But even if you ask heterosexual men, and by extension, other people who ship Steve and Peggy and think that Steve and Peggy should be together forever and agree with the choices that Endgame made as a movie, you will get a lot of people saying, no, Steve and Bucky are just friends. So my question to the heterosexuals is, why is that? What about the subtext is it that you cannot see? And I know the answer to this. This is mostly a rhetorical question. Obviously, the answer being, homophobia, internalized homophobia, heteronormativity, not being able to see the effects of heteronormativity, etc., etc. I know that answer. But, I think you guys should dissect that. That's just like people. What is it about queer subtext that you are blind to? Anyway, let me play the edited scene. Again, this is sped up, so if you're listening, you might want to skip ahead a couple of seconds, 30 seconds, so that it's not annoying to you, but I'm just going to play the scene so that you guys can see that if you continue playing the song, the crescendo of the song plays during the climax of the scene when they make eye contact. And so here is that.
Getting the key. You really think I'd leave her? My wife kicked me out. Didn't know you were married. A lot of things you don't know about. You know me. No. I'm sorry to have to do this, but I had no place else to crash. Who else knows my name? Just my friends. Is that what you? It's up to you.
But words can wait until some other day. Kiss me once, then kiss me twice, then kiss me once again. It's been a long, long time. Haven't felt like this, my dear, since can't remember when. It's been a long, long time. You'll never know how many dreams I dream about you, or just how empty they all seem without you. So kiss me once, then kiss me twice, then kiss me once again. It's been a long, long time.
And by the way, for those of you wondering how I edited this, I made sure that both things had volume. So essentially what I did was I played the scene first. So the first half of the movie scene has a louder volume than the song, but you can still hear both the scene and the song. It just sounds like the song is echoing. Then when the action starts, I lowered the volume on the scene itself because the action is very, very loud, number one. But number two, the focus of me editing that the way that I did was to show you guys that if you continue playing it, the climax of the song reaches the climax of the scene. And then also, if you guys want the unedited, like unsped up version of the scene, just let me know, I'll send it to you. It was really easy for me to make. You can make it yourself most likely, but just in case, or you can ask me how I made it and I'll tell you everything that I did to make it and to make sure that it matched up. But yeah, just let me know. Oh, also, by the way, worth mentioning that literally every single actor in the Marvel universe at the time, because now, the roster has been changed a little bit, but at the time, a ton of the actors in the Marvel universe were saying, yeah, Bucky and Steve have something more romantic going on. And the Russo brothers would always kind of be like, oh, you're so funny. And this is what got me thinking, because it happened also with Leverage. One of the most queer episodes of Leverage, called The Rundown Job, has Elliot and Hardison nose to nose, and Elliot is telling Hardison, you are the best hacker I've ever seen. You are the most intelligent person. I know I have full and complete trust in you that you will get us out of this situation. I trust you with my life. And if I didn't, you wouldn't be here, right? John Rogers said about that scene that he took inspiration, his friend, who he saw as a brother, and he wrote in his blog, I wrote this scene with that in mind, with the context of my brother doing the same thing to me. And I told Christian Kane, the actor for Elliot, what this scene meant to me, and he delivered it exactly how I pictured it in my mind, exactly how it felt when my, friend, my brother, did that to me. So there is no queer subtext. But if you put it within the context of the rest of the episode, literally the rest of the episode and the rest of the show, there's a lot of queer subtext to that particular scene and to that particular episode. So then it got me thinking, is there a divide between how heterosexual people view romance and love versus how queer people view romance and love? The answer is yes. But in terms of brotherhood and, this whole idea that if two men are not friends and if two men are more than friends, they're brothers, rather than, on the queer side of things, on our side of things, the more fun side of things, if two men are more than friends, they're lovers. You know what I mean? Do you see where my confusion started, popping up? So that's why I said, usually speaking, queer baiting does not happen intentionally, because I do know that for John Rogers and for the Russo brothers, sometimes what we as, the queer community describes as queer or see as having queer subtext, other non-queer people see as sibling subtext. And incidentally, on that note, that would explain all of the men saying, no, Bucky and Steve are not romantically interested in each other, they're just friends. Regardless, it's still an interesting thing to consider, and it's still something that we should be considering as, media moves forward, and as we continue to deconstruct certain, belief systems, continue to talk about certain things, etc., etc. However, I say this not to excuse queer baiting, because, like I said, both John Rogers and the Russo brothers knew that people were reacting to their media in such a way that maybe they did not intend, right? And with the Russo brothers, I don't want to defend them, but in the Russo brothers' defense, they really did not seem to, how do I say this? In the Russo brothers' defense, they really seemed to be shocked and surprised by that reception, and they really did stand 10 toes down, that might be the subtext that you're seeing, but we intended it to be something completely different, and as such, it's gonna be completely different. Steve in our image is heterosexual, right? Still not an excuse, because still, as writers, as producers, you do still have a responsibility to your audience. And if a good chunk of your audience and a good chunk of your actors as well are saying, and even like the actors themselves, Chris Evans and Sebastian Stan, even they are saying, yeah, we do believe that there's something more going on with Steve and Bucky, it is your responsibility as a writer to consider the other option, right? Consider, okay, shit, maybe there is queer subtext. Maybe I didn't know. Maybe this is something that I need to just deconstruct within myself. But, it doesn't hurt exploring. It doesn't hurt talking about. It doesn't hurt rewriting a couple of things and seeing where it goes, seeing where it leads. Often as writers, a thing that I hear a lot among fellow writers is that the characters kind of guide the plot. And that's what you should let them do. You should let your characters speak for themselves. And maybe to non-writers, this might be a little bit weird, but you're the one that's writing the characters. How is it that you're letting your characters do the talking when you're the one making your characters do the talking, right? But essentially what that means is sometimes as a writer, you have an idea of where your story is going to go, what your characters are, who your characters are, what, belief systems they have, what their sexuality is, etc., etc. But then as you start writing your story and as you start fleshing the characters out, it turns out this actually doesn't suit them the way that I thought it would. They actually don't seem like the kind of person to do this. They seem like the kind of person to do this other thing. And that's happened to me several times. The amount of sexuality changes that one particular character of mine has had is, interesting. She started out being a different sexuality, and now she's a completely different sexuality, because as I was writing her and as I was fleshing her out, I was like, wait, this sexuality actually does not suit her. This other sexuality does. So still, I believe the Russo brothers still had kind of a responsibility to explore that and, say, okay, we did not intend for Steve and Bucky to have queer subtext, but maybe, because of the Captain America First Avenger movie, maybe that writer for that movie did intend for them to have queer subtext. Maybe, that's what the fans are seeing, and it's kind of translating over into our movies and the movies that we have written. So let's try and explore that a little bit more. Let's try and see where it goes. Let's try and have the characters speak to us. Let's ask the actors what they want to do. Are the actors comfortable with doing that? The actors were comfortable with, following a Steve and Bucky relationship, but instead they said, no, we're actually the writers and we say no, fuck you, right? To add on to this, Leverage's fandom and the Supernatural fandom are not Marvel fandom. What I mean by this is that the Marvel fandom did not sustain itself through the Stucky shippers. It sustained itself through being a Marvel Cinematic Universe. It kind of did the marketing for themselves, right? But in such a show like Supernatural, where the Destiel side of the fandom, the queer side of the fandom, is doing a lot of heavy lifting for your show and is doing a lot of marketing and a lot of, bringing awareness to the show, talking about the show, making people aware about the show, etc., and is giving you guys a shit ton of money, maybe don't say fuck you to that part of the fandom, right? Maybe don't string them along on purpose. And like I said, this was on purpose. This was deliberate, because both the writers and the actors were consistently feeding into this idea that Destiel was going to be canon. Watch out for next episode because we're going to make Destiel canon, or it's like a Destiel heavy episode or whatever, only to, in the finale, completely throw that away. And it was almost as if they were saying, we've made our money. Thanks for the money. We don't need you anymore. You made us really rich. and we love you for that, but fuck you. We don't need you anymore. We don't need to string you along anymore. And that's where I think queer baiting is really evil, is because oftentimes the writers will know exactly what their fans are thinking, and they will use that side of the fandom to do their marketing for them. Whenever there is a new season, instead of, paying for advertisements like any normal person would when they want to advertise their show, they instead will tweet something out like, watch out for so and so, wink wink, nudge nudge, right? And then what does it do? It gets the fandom excited, and it gets the fandom talking, and suddenly your show is trending, and suddenly, hey, you don't need to pay for advertisements because the fans are doing all the advertising for you. All the while, you have no intention of ever pleasing that side of the fandom, ever thanking that side of the fandom. That side of the fandom made your career, and you say fuck you to them. This is not to say that networks are often not also at fault. Networks are also often at fault. There have been instances of writers wanting to canonize their queer characters but not being allowed to because the network says, you're not allowed to do this. We're not going to publish this if you do X, Y, and Z. However, if you guys haven't noticed, this episode and this rant is particularly about the writers who know that they are participating in queer baiting and not doing anything or much of anything to stop queer baiting one way or the other. Not doing anything to either deny that their characters are queer outside of interviews, right? Not doing anything in the show, not doing anything to tell the actors, hey, please stop this. This is not the way that this is supposed to read. Not doing anything to canonize their queerness and say, you know what, yes, actually, let's canonize their queerness. So that's what this episode was about. And I say that, but I also don't want it to seem like I'm saying that writers should succumb to their fandom, because that's also not what I believe. I don't believe that writers should succumb to their fandom. I think when writers have a very clear idea of what it is that they want their media to say and what it is that they want their media to be, that is a merit that is worth having. You shouldn't feel the need to succumb to your fandom and to be like, oh, my fandom is bullying me, I'm going to change everything about my piece of media, because that is how you get muddy media that doesn't make any sense, and that's mostly just fan service. What I am saying, however, is that if in fact you do have a very clear idea of what it is your characters are and what it is your characters are not, in the case of Supernatural, in the case of Leverage, there is no merit in muddying the waters you yourself as a writer because you want to keep both sides of your fandom happy. That's actually the opposite of what I'm describing, right? This was more of a ranty episode. I hope it wasn't too unorganized and too difficult for you guys to follow, but yeah, I just wanted to rant about queer baiting. Oh, I forgot to mention the whole reason why we're even here, the whole reason why I even decided to make an episode about queer baiting at all is because there's a new sheriff in town when it comes to queer baiting, and that is the Call of Duty franchise. Call of Duty has been around for ages, and when it was first around, it was back in, the early 2000s, and recently they have experienced a reboot. Back in the early 2000s, the characters that were kind of most popular were Simon Ghost Riley, John Soap McTavish, John Price, and Kyle Gaz Garrick. Those are the main four characters. I should say main four characters that survived the reboot, because there was another popular member in the team Task Force 141 called Gary Roach Sanderson, but he did not survive the reboot. He's not in the reboot, so. And then when they experienced a reboot, those characters came back with a new and improved story, according to the developers. People were really excited about it. They wanted to see, with new graphics, new technology, new mechanisms, etc. It was going to be a good game, according to people. They were really excited about it. Back in the day, there was a portion of the fandom who did ship Soap and Ghost because of journals that Soap had written in those times, with that storyline and, just the interactions that Soap and Ghost had. So then when the reboot was announced, people were kind of like thinking, okay, are they going to follow up on Ghost and Soap? Is there gonna be like a new reboot of that relationship and their like closeness and whatever? And kind of yes, kind of not. For the first one, I don't think Soap was a part, like a character, and then for the second one, he was, but their relationship was more nostalgia bait, if anything, right? Where it was in universe, Soap was a brand new member of the team that Ghost hadn't really talked to, that Ghost didn't really know too well, but he was using nicknames for him, and then Soap was saying, you know, like, only Ghost can call me by these nicknames, and then Soap asked Ghost to see his face, so it was kind of like they were closer than they should have been in universe, but you know, that's what I mean by nostalgia baiting. And then for, you know, the third game, Soap dies. He died in the original too, so no spoilers there. But then, you know, now a fourth game has been announced. And one, for the trailers, Ghost was wearing something that Soap was also wearing. So then one of the fans tweets about that and is like, oh my god, he was wearing like Soap's scarf or whatever it was. This means that they're canon or whatever. And so then the developers of the game reply to that and are like, yes, he was wearing Soap's scarf, you know, Ghost loves Soap, he misses him or whatever, and people took that as confirmation. But what me and my friend were discussing is that is not confirmation. That is just a marketing tactic to get you to interact with the game, to see if Ghost is going to say anything about missing Soap, right? To see if Ghost is going to say anything about, he was my boyfriend, I'm so heartbroken, or I had a crush on him and I never got to tell him, or, you know, we were in love with each other and we had just planned our first date and this is so devastating. Nothing like that is going to happen in the game, because it's just a marketing tactic to get you to tune into the game to see if that is going to happen. And so that is why I'm even making this episode in the first place, and why I titled it the way that I did, because we are more than just a marketing tactic, and we should be recognized as more than just a marketing tactic. And I'm sick and tired of being used as a marketing tactic. And I have more to say about this, kind of like not necessarily queer baiting, but I do have more to say about the women side of things, you know, the femme side of things, because there is a queer character within the Call of Duty community, and she's a woman, and she is canonically married to a woman. And you know who's not talking about the woman who is canonically married to a woman? The same people who are wanting Soap and Ghost to be canon. That is a topic for another day. I'm just saying, right? So anyway, that is all that I have for you guys today. Be sure to check out the links in the show notes and in the description anyway, because I do have things there for you. I do have some things that you can read up on to learn more about queerbaiting, learn more about how it affects the community, and learn more about supernatural as it relates to queerbaiting, right? I'm not advocating for you guys to watch the show. I think unless you are watching it through less than legal means, I don't think you should get into it. I'm not advocating for anything. In fact, I'm telling you to not watch the show. Anyway, that is everything that I have for you guys today. Thank you so much for watching, if you watched all the way, or listening, if you listened all the way through. And I hope my audio quality is so much better. I really hope so, because I don't want to have to return this. Ooh, what is the next episode going to be about? Oh, I had an idea for the next episode, but I next episode, feminism. So the next episode, we're going to be talking about feminism and what it has turned into, because I'm much so in disagreement with what feminism has turned into. But, before I forget, I have a new podcast. It is called Curiosity Killed the Cat, but Satisfaction Brought It Back. Hence why I asked you guys to tell me what cat you thought I was. Kath was the only one to respond and say that I was a Himalayan cat. So the Himalayan cat is on the cover of my brand new podcast. New episodes come out every other week. Same with this podcast. New episodes come out every other week. So technically I'm releasing new content every week. But so on that podcast, we're going to be talking about more like historical stuff, how things came to be. It's more like a deep dive episode. I'm thinking of uploading episodes onto YouTube, except for they're going to be audio only. So if you guys are okay with that, then there will be audio only episodes on YouTube, okay? I don't want to hear any comments. I don't want to see any comments talking about, oh, but why is there nothing happening on the screen? It's because it's an audio only podcast. Okay. Anyway, now, bye. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you guys next time.